Andrew Carnegie's Steel Company for nearly $400 million and used it to form the U.S. Steel Corporation in 1901. But not content with just controlling the railroads, Morgan also built the General Electric into a great industrial conglomerate by merging the Edison General and the Thomson-Houston Electric Companies. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish-American industrialist who led the enormous expansion of the American steel industry in the late 19th century. Andrew Carnegie did for steel what Rockefeller did for oil. In the 1870s, he realized that the steel rails being introduced in England were superior to the iron rails used in America, and that it was only a matter of time before American railroads imitated their English cousins. With the fortune he made from business, among others, he built Carnegie Hall, and later he turned to philanthropy and interest in education, founding the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Carnegie Institution of Washington, Carnegie Mellon University, and the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh. Carnegie was not the only one interested in philanthropy. With the advent of these tycoons and their paychecks, industrialists took care of creating public institutions and backing up other organizations benefiting the entire population. From his very first paycheck, Rockefeller gave 10% of his earnings to his church. Major Rockefeller charitable ventures included the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Foundation, and in total, Rockefeller donated about $550 million. In central locations where workers and resources went to fuel all the production. Immigrants and displaced rural workers flocked to the cities, trying to find employment. People who had great wealth used their fortunes extravagantly. They built large and grand palaces as their homes. These houses were known as Millionaires' Row. However, the vast majority of the population barely survived.
There's a great difference between classes across the United States during this time period. In 1890, only 1 million of the nation's 12 million families earned more than $3,000 a year, and the average income of these 11 million families was $380, far below the line of poverty. Many Americans from rural America and immigrants from Europe flocked to the cities. Dirty tenant areas spread across the country, and disease was common. Americans worked with sewing machines, phonographers, skyscrapers, and electric lights, yet most people labored in the shadow of poverty. The poor urban areas experienced horrible sanitation and a terrible smell. Running water was scarce, and no one knew how to clean up the ubiquitous horse manure.
During the 1880s, almost 10,000 strikes and lockouts plagued the city. Near 700,000 workers struck in just 1886. The results were horrendous. However, none larger than the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The B&O Railroad cut wages, workers struck spontaneously, and soon it spread nationwide. In Baltimore, the Maryland militia fired on strikers, leaving 11 dead and 40 wounded. In Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie's mentor, Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, argued strikes be given a rifled diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread. In Philadelphia, employees on strike burned much of the city before federal enforcement came to aid. Factory work was dangerous, and few factories took responsibility for employees' deaths. The new technology availability made many people wealthy, and also brought immigrants by the thousands. Former farmers and country people, along with immigrants, came to urban regions with hopes of making a life for themselves. 1893, Chicago World's Fair was a display of power, with the White City and the whole world watching. The large cities that formed around urbanized areas promoted the development of public buildings and recreation, like libraries, schools, and parks. The contrast of beautiful museums and poor areas was distinct. Since many people were crowded together, they formed their own public schools and libraries. Appreciation for art was a big deal, and theaters sprung up with the schools.
Go.
Puritan work ethic is the value one finds in working hard and efficiently. It became important in factories because with everyone doing the same thing, it was vital for workers to see meaning in their specific position. Social Darwinism is the notion that people, races, and demographic groups are subject to the same kind of natural selection that Charles Darwin saw in nature. It was used to support conservatism and capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries because societies were an organism that could evolve and purge the weak. The poor were considered unworthy of aid, and the rich were the strong. Horatio Alger was a proponent of this theory with his dime novels Ragged Dick, Tattered Tom, and Luke and Pluck. They told the stories of men who made a name for themselves in American society.
William Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall provided more services to the poor than any city government before it, although far more money went in Tweed's own pocket. It was the executive committee of the Democratic Party in New York City. It was named for Delaware chief Tamanend. It helped get voting rights for the propertyless white males, and corruption extended to the highest levels of government. Franklin D. Roosevelt took away most of its power after it failed to support him in an election. During Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, the president and his cabinet were implicated in the credit mobbler, the gold conspiracy, the whiskey ring, and the notorious salary grab. The whiskey ring is the most famous of the four. It was when whiskey distillers decided to cheat the government of the federal tax revenue. There were suggestions that the illegal money was going to re-elect Grant. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. saw the first real boom of new arrivals to the United States. During the Civil War, it significantly dropped, but after the war ended, it began to accelerate again. Approximately 10 million immigrants came to the United States during this time, what is known as the New Immigration. Some of them were prosperous farmers looking for fresh lands. Many of them were impoverished peasants looking for the American dream in mills, mines, and factories. Most of the immigrants flocked to the U.S. from European countries, especially Germany, Poland, Italy, Slavic countries, Scandinavian countries, and Ireland. Many of them came over very poor and with few possessions, education, or experience, providing a large, cheap labor force to fuel the massive economic and industrial growth. A large contingent of them were coming into the West Coast all the way from China. Their labor was used extensively to build the railroad system in California and Nevada. However, Chinese labor was opposed by many, and immigration from China was banned in 1882 in the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act stemmed from nativist ideas shared by many citizens. These nativists believed that the Eastern European and Asian immigrants would outbreed them and take over their once pure race. Many of these nativists were members of the Know Nothing Party, a political party that strongly opposed Roman Catholics and other immigrants. Immigrants saw America's cities as perhaps crowded and dirty, but filled with chances for work, education, and cultural stimulation, whereas natives viewed them as crowded, dirty prisons. In places like New York and Chicago, more foreign tongues were spoken than English, and many ethnics did not melt. In general, they got along, and for many, even the worst conditions were far less hopeless than those they had left behind.
In Chicago, immigrants flooded the city for work in the meatpacking industry, railroads, and factories, creating some of the worst slums in the world at the time. Immigrants came from southern and eastern Europe, including many Irish who came to build the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Chicago's Polonia is home to over 1 million residents of Polish descent, and Chicago is considered the largest Polish city besides Warsaw. In Polonia, where Polish businesses, restaurants, newspapers, and churches thrive, Polish is still the predominant spoken language today.
Yeah.